Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some PathOfExile discussion. What I wanted to do today is put together a list of potential League Starter ideas for patch 3.23 and be clear about whether they're things that I think are very reliable, somewhat risky, or very risky. All of these are builds that I have considered playing as a League Starter, and many of them have outstanding guides that I can recommend. However, the ones that I mark as spicy are definitely not for beginning players. I want to just be really clear about that. If you're someone that knows how to make a build yourself, you can definitely tinker around with those ideas and construct something from them. But if you're not someone who's got experience at least clearing the first couple of Voidstone bosses, then I would suggest that you probably want to go with one of the more reliable ones. Of course, it's entirely up to you. Firstly though, a really quick aside, who needs a strong league start? Your league goals should influence your choice of starter build. The more that you want to chase prestigious items like Mageblood or Headhunter or Hateforge, the more that you need to have a strong league start. Getting yourself a strong league start is something that will catapult you towards some of these more prestigious items because it will give you a snowballing advantage in currency. They'll then put you in a better spot if you want to then later pick up some of these expensive things, or even potentially go further, pick up a mirrored copy of one of the best weapons in the league, or even test yourself at mirror tier crafting, which tends to require many mirrors worth of currency in order to do it. Now for some people, the most fun way to play the game is just to chill out and play something weird. And weird builds actually can do pretty well these days. Doing so is going to reduce your chance of getting your hands on one of these chase items, and sometimes that balance is going to be worth it. You might have more fun overall if you play something zany and you play it from the start all the way up to deep end game, and see just how far you can get on your Guardian Elemental Hit Barrage character. However, one thing that's very important is that there's a lot of new skills in this league, and ultimately anything that is new is somewhat of a risk. Even if it's very similar to an existing skill, there's often little nuances that are just not apparent. So to summarize this disclaimer, the more desperate you are to acquire chase items in this league, the more important it is to you that you go with a tried and tested and proven league starter, and ideally one you've played before and that you know how to play already pretty well. The second thing before we get into builds is that content specialization should affect your choice of character. There are some characters that are just all-arounders. They're not S tier at anything, but they're A tier or B tier at worst at pretty much everything. Classic example here is pretty much anything on the Juggernaut Ascendancy. It's tough, it can do pretty much all content in the game, it's just not necessarily the best at doing things where speed is of the essence. But then some characters make big sacrifices in some areas of their build in order to excel at certain types of content. For example, if you want to excel at Heist, there is a certain minimum threshold of tankiness you want on your character, and generally speaking, this is a well-geared Deadeye. Once you reach this point, you don't really benefit much more in Heist from becoming more tanky. But if you invest further in move speed, you end up becoming better both at Heist and also as a bonus at the Labyrinth. So you end up creating a specialized character that is S tier at both Heist and also the Labyrinth, but that might be B tier or worse in other content and is completely unviable in hardcore play. Another classic example here is a Slayer that might allocate Vaal Pact because Vaal Pact makes their build really feel tanky. Then if they go into the Labyrinth, they're going to have a lot of trouble there because Vaal Pact is absolutely terrible when you're in the Labyrinth. So if you have a content specialization plan, let that plan dictate your build. And if all the builds that specialize at the type of content that you want to run don't look like fun to you, then you want to just specialize in a different type of content instead. The third important note before we get into the builds is Ultimatum is back, and Ultimatum is possibly not the same as it was in patch 3.14. This mechanic requires capacity to project damage while you're mobile. That is really important. You also want to be moderately tanky in Ultimatum as well, but you also can't rely on being just pure defense either, because there is the Ruin mechanic, which if it's the same as it was in 3.14, could cause you to fail encounters even though you weren't slain by the monsters in them. At least that's the way it played out in 3.14 though. It could be a little bit different this time around. Let's start with Righteous Fire. Righteous Fire has changed and the old build guides for it no longer really apply, but there is still a very solid core of a build there. Righteous Fire needs to be built differently to builds that were optimized for the game as it was in patches 3.22 and earlier. You need to prioritize different stats on your character. You no longer care anywhere near as much about gem level, and instead you care a lot more about energy shield on your character as a stat. Now the Inquisitor versions are arguably optimal now, and you want to aspire to your character's life total plus their energy shield total being considerably in excess of 7,000 by the time that your gems are starting to hit level 20. At this point, you're going to be dealing comparable damage to what you were dealing before Righteous Fire was overhauled. Anything further that you can get is just going to make this into a buff, not a nerf. Now, Inquisitor is in a more favourable spot on the passive tree and also has more access to sustain for energy shield, and as a result tends to be the better choice when you have a large hybrid life pool like this. If you want early advice here, I would suggest that you go to Pohx.net and go to Pohx's guide for Righteous Fire Inquisitor. Once you outgrow that, then CaptainLance's Ivory Tower versions of Righteous Fire are probably where you want to graduate to. Now, fair warning, Ivory Tower might be a very expensive item in patch 3.23 because the people who love Righteous Fire are all going to want it. But what if you hate being a meta slave? What if you want to play Righteous Fire but you want to do it in a spicy way that's different to the meta? Well, in that case you can run Righteous Fire on the Chieftain Ascendancy and use the new Fire Trapper blasting that was just spoiled today. Now, this is not for Burning Ground. It doesn't actually inflict Burning Ground at all, but it is there to inflict ignites on enemies, which will then proliferate around. You're already wanting to invest in ignite chance and in ignite proliferation on a Chieftain Righteous Fire character anyway, because your Hinekora explosions, when they ignite, they just wipe out screens. So, because you're already scaling ignite chance, you're already scaling fire.multi because you're a Righteous Fire character, this puts you in a good spot to take advantage of igniting with this new Fire Trapper blasting. Now, most of the defensive tech that I advocated in patch 3.22 when I played a Chieftain Righteous Fire build is weaker in this league than it was last league, and that's due to the absence of, most importantly, the Namahu tattoo of the Firewalker. However, the build still has legs. It's just going to take a little bit more work to put together, and it's going to perform worse until you get yourself well established. That said, Ivory Tower versions are my recommendation. This Chieftain option is just if you want something a little bit spicier. Now, what if you want to try a whole bunch of new skills and you're not yet ready to commit to one of them? Then what you want to do is play Spell Totem Support and you want to play a Hierophant Ascendancy. This way, you can run a Spell Totem character and then you can only respec 10 or 20 points each time you want to change gem on your character and try out something new. Elemental damage, hit-based spells all have very, very similar passive trees when they're built as Spell Totem characters. You can start as Arc Totem, you can then later respec into Crackling Lance of Disintegration once you acquire that gem, or you could respec into Stormburst, or you could respec into even Fireball Totems. Not that I recommend Fireball Totems for a second, but you could respec into it if you wanted to and find out why I don't recommend them. All of these are options that you've got if you decide to go with the Hierophant, and you decide that you want to go with a Spell Totem backbone for your passive tree, and also for your Ascendancy notables. Now, if you do want to build a totem character, what I suggest you do firstly, just to get yourself started, is to go to poe.ninja for inspiration. Now, this site is not the entirety of the solution you're going to need in order to make a build, but it is a very important part of it. What you want to do is look at how people built up totem builds in patch 3.22. Ask yourself, does this build's core mechanics still work? And you want to be able to do the necessary research to establish that yourself. Have a look at the build and ask, are there any choices that I would change? Have a look at the build and ask, was this dependent upon tattoos? There is also the streamer Tatantial too, who often plays totems and is generally regarded as quite an authority on them. So this is how you go to POE Ninja and extract information that's useful for it. Firstly, you go to builds. Once you're there, it'll load up a list of builds people were playing at the very end of the Ancestor League. Not really interested in what people ended up with. What you're interested in is what they were doing when they had bad gear very early in the league. So let's go to day 3. That's in the snapshot, and that will then refresh all of the builds that were being played. Now, we've already decided that we want to play a build that is totem based. What do totems all have in common? Well, they have in mind that their main skills mode, 5+ links, is going to be totem based. So we're going to click that, and then we also want to exclude builds that are using both a totem and a normal skill. Ultimately, this is most of the Deadeyes. So we click on normal, but we actually want to exclude that, so we then go with the circle with a line through it, and then at that point we're left with all the builds that are using totems as a primary 5-link skill, but that do not have any other 5-link skills. Now that we've done that, we can have a look and see, oh, there's some Elementalists and there's some Hierophants. Now, Elementalist builds here are probably playing some sort of Explosive Arrow Ballista build, and we'll have a look at something else. So let's just exclude anyone that's playing Explosive Arrow as a 5-link, and have another look at what we've got. Again, there's a whole bunch of ballista characters. What we might do here, in fact, is go down lower to where it says what sort of weapons are they using, and let's just ban anyone that's using a bow. And now that we've done this, we're going to have a list of people who are genuinely playing a totem build, and we can have a look and see what they were playing. Shockwave Totem, very popular. Freezing Pulse Totem, Ice Spear Totems. Now, something that's of note is that pretty much all of these were affected by the Heat Shiver nerf. It's not crushing, it's not completely build destroying, but you might want to consider some of the other options that are around. Stormburst, Holy Flame Totem, these are some examples of skills that were being used extensively last league that haven't been affected by that nerf. Let's however look at Arc Totems, because that's something that's somewhat off meta, something I wouldn't have personally thought of myself as a really high performing character, but is definitely something that's got some legs. And once you've done that, now you can see most common body armor they're using is Soul Mantle. Most common unique jewel that they're using is Self-Flagellation. They're often using Kikazaru, and that would be used in order to mitigate the amount of self-cursing that's done by Soul Mantle. Might even be using 2 of these in order to get that reduced effective curses on you up to a massive level. And then on top of that, there's a whole bunch of other information you can draw here. Or, one of the most useful things, show the passive tree heat map, and then you can get a sense as to what the texture of people's passive trees look like. The closer the color is to red on the rainbow, the more people are using that particular node. So that can give you a real sense of what successful players were doing there. And if you wanted to build around one of the new transfigured versions of Arc, but as a totem delivery build, then this is an option as to how you might start that. What if you didn't want Arc, but you wanted something else instead? Well, you can either just respec a few points on the tree, that's one option, or you can just change off Arc and then pick something else. Maybe this time we want to look at what it looks like when people are playing Blazing Salvo Totems. You'll see that this time they're picking up this fire node here, and that's at the expense of some of the lightning nodes that were taken on an Arc build. But otherwise, the core texture of the tree is pretty much the same. Now, the last thing you want to do is have a look for things that are taken by 100% of these builds. So obviously Spell Totem support is mandatory, but then we have Ritual of Awakening, Pursuit of Faith, Arcane Blessing. This is the way that the Ascendancy is set up. Then we have almost everyone taking Ancestral Bond. The last thing you can't really get from POE Ninja, but it is something that you'll get if you just look up a whole bunch of these and look up the characters as they were, is a sense as to what sort of gear they were using that might have changed. For example, I think you'll find that there's a lot of people using Shaper Influence shields that have +1 maximum totem on them. So that's how to use POE Ninja in order to work out details of a build once you've decided what you want to play, assuming that that build was something you could play in patch 3.22. Okay, let's go through an extremely spicy option. We've covered a couple of safe things so far. This is completely untested. This can't be tested yet. My first thoughts are that this could be very, very strong, but I'm making absolutely no promises on this. It looks good on paper, but I don't know that it's going to work as well as it looks. This is going to sound weird, but Saboteur Minions. The reason you're going Saboteur is just for one notable, and that is the one that causes your mines to have 150% increased aura effect. You are going to be using Summon Raging Spirit in much the same way that the Guardian Ascendancy uses it. That is, you're going to get a huge amount of flat elemental damage that is added through the use of auras, and that's going to be used in order to cause your little minions to do a lot more damage. But instead of using the Wrath Aura and the Anger Aura that are supplied by your Ascendancy, you're instead going to use the very newly spoiled Pyroclast Mine of Sabotage. This provides an aura that adds a tremendous amount of fire damage taken to any enemy that is within 3.5 meters of it. The numbers on it might look bad, but that's until you realize that it stacks with itself many times over. If you can reach the cap on this, which you're probably not quite going to reach the cap on it, then it ends up being 12 times as good as Anger. If you can't reach the cap on it, well, you might only get 8 times as good as Anger. Well, the Guardian's entire Ascendancy provides about 3 times as much damage as a level 20 Anger Gem. You are potentially getting 8 to 12 times as much damage as a level 20 Anger Gem, and that is the reason that I think this has some real potential. That said, this is something that is not yet tested in game. It's going to be a very clunky playstyle, and as a result, it's definitely not going to be for everyone. Where I think this is going to be weak is in clearing. Where I think this is going to shine is in boss killing. This is going to have potentially very high single target damage, and ultimately, we've just got to test this out in practice to know whether it's going to be good or not. But it's something that if you're an experienced player and you're keen to explore this option, I'm presenting it for you. Make up your own mind, but if you're a new player, definitely stay away from this one. And for that reason, I'm definitely not providing any information on how you would build this beyond just the core interaction, because if you're not sure how to do that, then I would suggest that you would pick something more reliable instead. On the passive tree, all you get from the Saboteur Ascendancy is that 150% mine aura effect and some defenses, but that is a tremendous amount of offense. Later on, once those Forbidden Flame and Forbidden Flesh jewels exist, then you want to trade for those, and then you want to respec as a Trickster, because a Trickster has more defense, and then you can Forbidden Flame, Forbidden Flesh in these nodes. Next, we're going to go with one of the top proven performers from patch 3.22, Hexblast Minions. This is something that's usually played as a Saboteur. This build is S tier at Sanctum, A+ tier at bossing, and it's at least serviceable in all aspects of the game. It's one of the better all-arounders, and it is a really, really strong choice if you're looking for a versatile and safe league starter. That said, I will say that I don't think this is going to be the best Ultimatum build in the world. Ultimatum wasn't in the game in 3.22, but it just doesn't feel like it plays to the strengths of Hexblast Minions very well. Next, Lightning Arrow. This is still overpowered. Grimro has a guide for it that was put out last league. It's still quite accurate. Jedi wasn't nerfed, Lightning Arrow wasn't nerfed. This is meta in 3.22. It's going to be meta again. Really, really strong build. Really strong at all aspects of the game except bossing. And when it comes to bossing, it's not dumpster tier at it either. It is serviceable at bossing. And that's something that's really important. Artillery Ballista really addresses its key weaknesses there and makes it into a powerhouse build overall. The next build I want to recommend is Palsteron's Caustic Arrow Ballista Pathfinder. This is something that Palsteron has used in the past and that was a perfectly serviceable build in the past, but it has been giga-buffed with one of the transfigured versions of Caustic Arrow. That is something that this build was really, really looking for. A bow skill that hits a large area and deals a lot of instant applied chaos damage. That damage can then be used to poison, and that poison can then spread courtesy of the Pathfinder Ascendancy. Pathfinder is just extremely strong at the moment. In a lot of ways, it's one of the best Ascendancies in the game, and this build plays very hard to that Ascendancy's strengths. The next thing I want to recommend is another versatile package. Akin to the way that spell totems could be used with a whole lot of different spells, so too can cast on Critical Strike. Now this is the more advanced of the two packages that you can play. If you're a newer player and you just want to play a whole bunch of different spell gems, then I would suggest to you that the Spell Totem package is a safer option. If you feel pretty confident with the basics of build crafting, then Cast on Critical Strike is something where you can put it together with one payload gem. Let's say you decide you want to start out with your payload gem being Purifying Flame. You don't like Purifying Flame, you can then change that over to Arc. Or you can change it over to Firestorm of Meteors. Or you can change it over to a large number of other potential skills. Now, I do think you probably want to start this as a Power Charge Ascendancy. Even though Assassin is quite off meta at the moment, I do think it is one of the easiest ones to get going for Cast on Critical Strike. Occultist is a little bit harder to get going, but it does also have the tools that this setup needs. Now, Hexblast of Havoc looks very interesting indeed, potentially using Blasphemy in order to inflict curses, and I would say that this is at the moderate level of spiciness, whereas the last couple of things have been more beginner friendly. Cast on Critical Strike can be played safe with proven setups, or you can go really experimental. For example, you could use Cosprey's Malice to disgorge Frostbolts, and then use the new Vortex that consumes multiple Frostbolts at once, and then makes a giga hit-based Vortex. You've got this flexibility where you can do a lot of different things with this character. Your safe and proven delivery mechanisms for Cast on Critical Strikes are Cyclone and Barrage. There's also one of the new Steel skills that definitely looks like it will be as well. Spicier one, Flicker Strike of Power. Your proven payloads, Ice Spear, Ice Nova, Arc. I'm deliberately excluding Forbidden Rite here. Forbidden Rite is a proven payload on Cast on Critical Strike. It's one of the most popular ones, but it's also something that requires a very large amount of setup to get going. More risky payloads, if you're interested in that, are Lightning Conduit of the Heavens and Hexblast of Havoc. And if you want something that's ultra spicy, you go with Flicker Strike of Power as your delivery mechanism, your payload is Hexblast of Havoc, and you are scaling damage through the use of poison. I will make no promises that one will work, but it does at least sound like it'll be fun to try. The next build is actually the one I am most leaning towards starting at the moment. This is something that was playtested by streamer Jungroan, and he did a Vaal Flameblast Ignite build that uses Frostblink for a lot of its clear. Now what this build does is it sets off Vaal Flameblast against medium and heavy bosses. This tends to just delete them because of the key tech of this character, which is that the duration of ailments can be reset by re-inflicting a curse on the enemy. Arcanist Brand linked to curses is all that you need in order to get these shenanigans going, and once they're going, they go really, really, really well. Jungroan's an expert racer, and with his play skill he was able to beat the Searing Exarch and the Eater of Worlds in about 6 hours, and then after another 10 hours or so of farming gear, was able to take on the Uber Maven, Uber Cirrus, and Uber Shaper. Now, most players are not going to be able to do those Uber bosses anywhere near that quickly, but the core concepts of the build are very, very solid. This is not a giga tanky build, but it does have pretty solid defenses against physical damage, and also it's a very safe playstyle because once you drop your Arcanist Brand and your Vaal Flameblast, after that you can focus almost entirely on dodging, because you don't need to be focusing on dealing damage to the monster. Really, that is the main appeal to me, and that's the reason that I think that this is probably at the top of my personal list of things to play at the league start. But there's plenty of other options here. Hopefully you have fun in 3.23 and figure out something that you are keen to play yourself. May your Vaal Orbs have interesting results.